What is a cult? Formally is defined as a small group devoted to a person, an idea, or a belief system, often existing in tension with the wider society around it. But definitions don't capture how these groups actually operate, because most people assume cults are easy to identify, something extreme, something isolated, something clearly outside religion. But that assumption is where the danger begins, because many of these groups don't start on the fringes. They begin as something recognizable: a church, a prayer movement, or a community built around faith. The shift happens gradually. Authority becomes centralized and questioning becomes discouraged. And belief is no longer guided by doctrine, but by individuals claiming direct access to truth. By the time that line is crossed, what looks like religion from the outside can function very differently on the inside. This was the case for the Seven Angels ministry. Hold up. Before we continue with the video, I'd like to thank you for staying tuned this far. Don't forget to press the like button, press the subscribe button, and drop a comment below. This helps the video get to more people who need to hear the truth. And also, if you like going through documents, files, and links, then check the description box below, because we've linked references, links, and Google Drives that'll help you understand the topic even better. Okay, without wasting your time, let's get back to the video, and trust me, what's coming next is even more shocking. A lot of classifications around the Seven Angels ministry are usually wrong, because it didn't belong to any recognized denomination. It's not Catholic, it's not Methodist, it's not even a structured Pentecostal church. The closest accurate description is a breakaway African independent prophetic charismatic sect. Now, that sounds technical, but it matters because African independent churches, often called AICs, didn't emerge randomly. They developed as a response. During colonial and missionary expansions, Christianity in Africa was heavily controlled by Western institutions, shaping not just belief but the culture, the language, and authority structures. African independent churches broke away from that. They rejected external control and built churches that were locally led, spiritually expressive, and rooted in African identity and experience. So instead of rigid doctrine and hierarchy, authority often comes from visions, prophecy, dreams, and individuals believed to be spiritually chosen. In these spaces, truth isn't always something fixed and written. It's something revealed, something that can evolve depending on who is claiming to receive it. And that's where things can shift, because without external accountability, authority can move very quickly from interpreting belief to defining reality itself. And in this case, it did, because the leadership, well, Mangoba brothers didn't just position themselves as spiritual guides. They claimed to be angels, direct agents of God, beings operating above normal human status. And that distinction matters, because the moment a leader stops pointing towards God and starts positioning themselves as something divine, you are no longer dealing with a church structure. You're dealing with centralized, unquestionable authority. So, let's speak about the origins of this church. Every movement has a beginning, but some don't begin with an idea. They begin with a man and a moment he claimed changed everything. For the Seven Angels ministry, that man was Simpiwo Mangoba. Before the followers, before the doctrine, before the compound in Ngobo, he was just a school teacher. By all accounts, ordinary. He wasn't famous, he didn't hold political power, he wasn't leading a movement, but he had something harder to measure: presence. Because people who encountered him would later describe the same thing, that the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the way he made people feel seen. His voice could calm a room. His words didn't just inform, they reached into people's fears, their struggles, their needs for something more. And then, according to him, everything changed. Sometime in the 1980s, during what he described as a period of deep personal struggle, Simpiwo claimed he was visited, not in a dream, not in a vision, but in a physical encounter. He said an angel descended into his room, filling it with a light that did not belong to this world. And this angel brought a message that would become the foundation of everything that followed. According to Simpiwo, the world as people knew it, jobs, schools, governments, even the banks, was just flawed. It was a system of control, a structure created by Satan to enslave humanity, and he had been chosen to stand against it. The angel, he said, gave him a purpose. He was to build a church, not just any church, but a sanctuary, a place that would separate the righteous from the corrupted world, a refuge for those preparing for the end times. He positioned himself not just as a messenger, but as something far greater, a chosen leader, a shepherd. In some accounts, he even began referring himself in biblical terms, aligning his role with figures like Moses, a deliverer leading people out of the corrupted system. This wasn't just preaching, it was identity. He was no longer just Siphiwo Manqoba, he was a man with a divine mandate. From that point, the structure of the church became very deliberate. Siphiwo would record his teachings, distribute those recordings amongst his followers, and instruct them to go out, preach, and recruit others using his teachings. This created a cycle: teach, distribute, and expand. Followers didn't just attend, they became extensions of the message, carrying his teachings into other communities, bringing more people into the fold. And the message itself was powerful in its simplicity. The world is corrupted, society is controlled, and salvation requires separation. For people who felt left behind, overlooked, or disconnected from mainstream systems, this wasn't just belief, it was compelling. But Siphiwo Manqoba wasn't building alone. At a critical point in the early growth of his movement, he became closely associated with Ndumiso Mtshali. Mtshali wasn't just a supporter, he was a religious figure in his own right, operating within the same independent church environment with influence, space, and standing in the community. And that's where the connection formed. Through shared belief and religious alignment, Siphiwo was able to establish his church activities on land linked to Mtshali. This wasn't a formal transaction, it was access built on trust, faith, and mutual spiritual purpose. The two men operated side by side, preaching within the same environment, drawing from overlapping communities and expanding influence in parallel. For a time, it worked, but underneath that arrangement was a fragile reality, because the church wasn't just a spiritual movement anymore. It was becoming something tangible. It had followers, resources, and growing financial contributions, which meant the land they stood on now mattered. Because whoever controlled the land controlled the movement. And in a system with no formal structure, no contracts, and no external oversight, that kind of power doesn't stay shared for long. That's where the partnership began to crack. As the church grew, so did the stakes, and with that came tension. The conflict reportedly was centered around control of church funds, ownership and authority over the land, and ultimately who had the final say over the movement. What started as a partnership began to fracture. Disagreements turned into arguments, arguments turned into confrontation, and at some point the confrontation turned physical. The exact details remain unclear and uncontested, but what is known is that the conflict between Siphiwo Manqoba and Ndumiso Mtshali escalated into violence, and it ended with Siphiwo dead. Not a natural death, not a quiet passing, a violent end, and with it, the original structure of the movement collapsed. But here's the part most people miss. His death didn't end the ideology, it didn't erase the message, it did something else. It fractured it and left it waiting to be rebuilt. Because years later, the same belief system would return, stronger, more controlled, and more dangerous. Years later, the story then shifts to Ngobo. Ngobo sits quietly along the R61 tucked between Butterworth and Queenstown. It's not a place you pass through by accident. You go there deliberately, or you just don't go there at all. Surrounded by rolling hills and valleys, it's a place that feels distant, removed, and almost insulated from everything around it. But Ngobo carries a history. It falls within the former Transkei, one of apartheid-era's Bantustans, where economic development was intentionally limited. Figures like Walter Sisulu have roots in this region, and Nelson Mandela attended school nearby at Clarksbury. So this is a place deeply tied to South Africa's political past, but its present day tells a different story. Limited economic opportunity, high unemployment, and heavy reliance on land and informal systems. And then there's the reputation. Ngobo has for years carried a nickname, Engobo Emaseleni, loosely translated as Ngobo, the place of thieves. The name traces back to patterns of livestock theft in the region. Cattle and sheep was taken away from surrounding areas. Over time, it became more than just a label. It became part of how the town was seen from the outside, a place associated with crime, with survival, with people doing what they need to do to get by. And that context matters because in places like Ngobo, where opportunity is limited, where institutions feel distant, and where survival is often uncertain, people aren't just navigating economics, they're navigating uncertainty itself. And in that space, what people need the most is an explanation, an answer to why things feel the way they do. And that's exactly where Sipiwo's message fit perfectly. The world is corrupt, society is controlled, and salvation requires separation. For people who already felt overlooked, disconnected, or left behind by mainstream systems, this wasn't just a belief, it felt like truth. And in a place like Ngobo, that kind of message doesn't just spread, it takes hold. After Sipiwo's death, the movement didn't continue, it collapsed entirely. The structure that he had built in KwaZulu-Natal fell apart, and the family disappeared from that space entirely. For a time, it seemed like the movement had ended with him, but it hadn't. Years later, in a different space under different leadership, it resurfaced, this time in Ngobo. Led by Simpiwo's wife, Noluvo Mangoba, and her sons, the movement was rebuilt, now under a new name, the Seven Angels Ministry. But this wasn't just a continuation, it was a transformation, because what had once been a loosely structured religious movement became something far more controlled, more isolated, more absolute. What was once a church became a system. From the outside, it could have been mistaken for any other church. The singing, the prayers, the Sunday gatherings, people arriving in cars, carrying Bibles, children in tow. But inside the walls of the Seven Angels Ministry, a different order was taking shape. Rumors began to circulate through Ngobo and the surrounding communities, whispers that joining the church wasn't just about faith. It came with a price, and the price was everything a person owned. Cars, bank accounts, family homes, all were handed over to the church leadership, not as offering or voluntary gifts, but as an act of complete obedience. The language used by the brothers left little room for negotiation. To follow God through them was to surrender your life, your wealth, your identity. Some congregants even cashed out their pensions they had been saving for decades. Others sold their houses, relinquished property, and emptied bank accounts. And those who complied were expected to leave the outside world behind entirely. Once inside, members were isolated, few left and fewer returned. Families reported loved ones disappearing into the church, vanishing from daily lives. Their names were fading from local streets. Members were discouraged from interacting with outsiders, forbidden from normal social life, and cut off from their previous identities. Children were even stopped from attending school. When questioned, the leadership justified this by claiming the education system was corrupt, influenced by evil, part of the broader spiritual battle. The church became a closed environment. For the Mangobas, this was more than wealth. It was controlled. Every asset, every surrendered item reinforced a system where loyalty was absolute and questioning authority was impossible. The church's power was no longer spiritual alone. It had become a force that governed lives, dictated futures, and erased independence. At this point, belief had moved beyond religion into control over reality itself. At the foot of the mountain in Ngobo, the group had established a compound. It consisted of corrugated iron shacks, overcrowded living spaces, and dozens of women and children living in confined conditions. At the same time, the leadership lived differently. Luxury vehicles were seen on the property, believed to be funded by members' surrendered wealth. The contrast was clear: control at the top, sacrifice at the bottom. Then something happened that forced the entire town to take notice. Massive hand-painted messages began appearing across the mountain overlooking Ngobo. Words so large they could be seen from the main road, impossible to ignore. They read Jehovah, God, and angel forces. The second was the word of the Lord is everlasting. The third was the end of 1,260 days. It's a new beginning. To outsiders, the words were cryptic, but for anyone familiar with biblical prophecy, the lost message carried a chilling weight. The 1,260 days is a reference repeated twice in the book of Revelations. Revelations 11 verse 3, where two witnesses prophesy for 1,260 days, and Revelations 12 verse 6, where the woman flees into the wilderness for 1,260 days, protected from prosecution. Both passages are linked to periods of trial, judgment, and divine intervention. To the seven angels' ministry, these verses weren't just scriptures, they were a timeline, a signal that their mission was urgent, transformative, and divinely sanctioned. The paintings on the mountain became a public declaration of power, a message that their spiritual authority extended beyond the confines of their compound. To the people of Ngobo, however, it looked like something else entirely. A warning, a looming symbol of the church's reach, impossible to ignore, hanging over the town like a silent, omnipresent force. The painted message on the mountains weren't just graffiti, they were a warning. And for years, many people in Ngobo dismissed the murmurs, assuming it was just another eccentric church. But the warning signs had been building long before the painting occurred. Families whispered about relatives who had disappeared into the church. Children were kept home from school. Adults were withdrawn from the community entirely. People were worried, but the Mangoba brothers had influence, and local police often turned a blind eye. The church control wasn't just spiritual, it extended into the very mechanisms of law and order in the area. By 2016, the situation could no longer be ignored. Social workers, accompanied by police, were forced to remove 21 children from the compound. The matter was formally escalated to the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious, and Linguistic Communities, also known as the CRL Rights Commission. The commission launched a full investigation. They interviewed members of the church leadership, including Banele Mangoba, the self-proclaimed angel and spokesperson for the ministry. What emerged from those interviews painted a troubling picture: rejection of state authority, complete isolation of members from the outside world, and a belief system that justified total control over followers. One commissioner, after reviewing the interviews and evidence, reportedly sent a formal warning to Parliament, describing the group as a ticking time bomb, predicting that it was only a matter of time before the situation exploded. But despite this warning, the church remained untouched. The CRL Commission lacked the legal authority to intervene, and with the brothers' influence over local authorities, nothing changed on the ground. Ngobo's quiet mountain town continued to watch powerlessly as the Seven Angels ministry grew stronger and more secretive. For years, the warnings about the Seven Angels ministry had been mounting. Whispered reports, children kept from school, social service interventions, and even a commission warning that the group could become dangerous. The warning signs were there long before the bullets flew. But nobody could predict just how far things would go. By early 2018, authorities believed the sect was under severe financial strain. Members weren't working, weren't attending school, and depended entirely on the ministry for food and shelter, all while surrendering their cars, money, and property to the leadership just to belong. Without regular income, without external support, and a growing number of dependents, the group was under pressure. What was once religion had become survival, and it was about to snap. Shortly after dawn on the 21st of February 2018, the quiet town on Ngobo woke up to violence. It didn't start at the police station, it started on the road. Two police officers were found shot dead along the roadside outside town, executed at close range. Investigators believe they were among the first targets. As the attackers moved through the area in the early hours, they encountered the officers and opened fire, eliminating any immediate resistance. Their vehicle was stolen, and from that moment, the situation escalated. The attackers then drove into Ngobo, heading straight for the police station. They entered without warning and opened fire. Inside, 3 officers were killed instantly inside the precinct. As the gunfire rang out, an off-duty soldier nearby heard the shots and moved in to investigate. He never made it inside. The moment he revealed himself, he was shot and killed. And this wasn't a hit and run, it was an operation. The attackers moved through the station, taking control of the scene and seizing weapons. By the time they left, they had stolen a police van and 10 firearms, weapons that would later be traced back to them. In the ensuing investigations, police discovered that the stolen weapons from the first 2 police officers were used in a robbery of a Capitec Bank ATM not far from the station, connecting the killing to the broader criminal activity. Court testimonies later revealed that individuals tied to the church had already been involved in violent crimes a year before, including robbing officers of their service pistols in towns like Butterworth and Gala, indicating a pattern of targeting law enforcement for their weapons. This wasn't paranoia, it was tactical. 2 days after the massacre, law enforcement traced the stolen weapons to the Seven Angels ministry compound. As police closed in, those inside opened fire. What began as a search operation turned into a bloody shootout. At least 7 suspects were killed, including several of the Mangoba brothers, who were leaders inside the compound. And what officers found during and after the raid transformed the narrative from tragedy to horror. Dozens of women and young girls were rescued from the compound, many believed to have been kept there in conditions described by authorities as closed off from the outside world. Investigators later reported that Mangoba brothers considered many of these women to be their wives, including minors, sexual relations seen by the leadership as part of the service to God. Girls as young as 12 were amongst those recovered, and birth certificates were reportedly not issued for many of the children in the compound. A 15-year-old girl was found on the property with 2 children, reportedly as the wife of one of the leadership figures, a detail that shocked legal authorities and mainstream religious commentators alike. And the carnage didn't end with the shootout. In the weeks and months that followed, more than 40 women and girls were taken for questioning and care. Several suspects were arrested and brought to court on multiple charges, including murder and robbery. Some members insisted that they still believe in the leadership, demonstrating how deeply internal doctrine had taken root in followers' minds. The scene at the compound told a different story from the one most outsiders had assumed. This wasn't just a religious community, it wasn't merely a strange church. It was a closed environment turned violent, where authority was absolute, men claimed divine right to control women and children, dissent was isolation, and criminal violence was justified by belief. By the time authorities took over the property, the Seven Angels Ministry was no longer just a religion that had lost its way. It was a deadly combination of extremist beliefs and organized criminality, leading to the death of protectors of the state and the unraveling of a community that had been hidden in plain sight. But the real question isn't just what happened in Ngobo, it's how it was allowed to happen. Because in South Africa, the law protects freedom of religion. Anyone can believe, anyone can practice, and that protection is important. But it creates a dangerous gray area, because where do we draw the line between faith and control? I mean, the CRL Rights Commission saw the warning signs, they investigated, they raised the concerns, but they didn't have the power to act decisively. And by the time law enforcement stepped in, it wasn't prevention, it was a response. So the question isn't just about what the Seven Angels Ministry was. The real question is how many groups like this exist right now, protected under the same laws? And more importantly, when does a church stop being a church? And who decides that before it's too late? This is the Need to Know channel, and thank you.